10 years ago, a tragedy in Bangladesh sent shockwaves through the global fashion industry. On April 24, 2013, a building collapsed, claiming over 1,000 lives and injuring 2,000 more. This wasn't an ordinary building. It was a manufacturing hub of the most popular brands like Primark, Walmart, Benetton, Mango, and Zara. And this disaster marked the deadliest structural failure in modern history, the most catastrophic garment factory disaster, and Bangladesh's worst industrial calamity. But how did a building that housed some of the world's biggest fashion brands become a death trap for so many innocent workers? What role did global giants like Primark, Walmart, and Zara play in this catastrophe? And how did the relentless pursuit of profit lead to this irreversible loss? Manufacturing clothing in developed countries can be quite expensive and counter-profitable for top brands, which is why sweatshops exist. If you've never heard of them, sweatshops are textile factories in developing nations where poor citizens are employed to produce clothing for global fashion brands at low wages and exploitative working conditions. In Bangladesh, there are 4,500 of them, and Rana Plaza was one of them before its unfortunate collapse in 2013. Built in 2006, Rana Plaza was an imposing building that housed several shops, a bank, and 5 garment factories that made apparel for global brands like Benetton, Zara, Mango, Walmart, Primark, and more. For years, business went on as usual in this building. Billions were made in the fashion industry as a result of the hard work of these workers at Rana Plaza and their factories like it around the world. But unknown to them, something was about to happen that would change their lives forever in a most irreparable way. On April 23, 2013, workers showed up to work as usual at their respective factories in the Rana Plaza building. However, it didn't take long before some started to notice some worrying cracks in the walls of the building. Alarmed, these workers alerted their supervisors and the building was immediately evacuated. Very likely reports about the building's conditions were forwarded to the owner of the building, Sohail Rana. But astonishingly later that day, Sohail would go to the media to announce that the building was safe and that workers could return to work the following day. Naturally, not many were convinced that the building was safe to return to for work, and all the shops along with the bank on the lower floors remained closed till further notice, despite Sohail's assurances. But then this begs the question of how thousands were still present in the building when the collapse happened. Well, when your day-to-day survival depends on earning every single day's wage, and when your boss threatens to withhold said pay for an entire month if you don't show up for work, even when your place of work is on the verge of collapse, you resume against your better judgment. Very likely in the minds of many who showed up for work on that fateful day, the thought, damned if we do, damned if we don't, reigned. Ultimately for them, it was a choice between a rock and a hard place. Stay home from work and get killed by poverty and hunger, or resume per your manager's orders and get crushed to death by your crumbling place of work. Unfortunately for those who went with the second option, their mental calculations were about to prove horrifyingly real. On the morning of April 24, 2013, workers were going about their daily activities when there was a sudden power outage. Power outages aren't uncommon in Bangladesh, and so the average Bangladeshi business owner always makes provisions for a backup power source. Normally, this helps to make sure the business keeps running smoothly despite power interruptions. But on this particular day, the backup generators would become the trigger for the collapse of the Rana Plaza and the demise of thousands. Those who were close to the building when it collapsed said it looked like the scene of an earthquake. At 8:57 a.m., Rana Plaza went down with a loud, frightful crash, leaving only the ground floor intact and trapping 3,122 individuals in its rubble. More than half of the victims of this disaster were women. But there were also several children trapped as well, children who were dropped off by their parents in the facility's nursery to be looked after while they worked. Soon after the collapse, local rescue emergency services, along with volunteer rescue workers, appeared on the scene to help rescue survivors and retrieve bodies from the wreckage. However, according to the UN's assessment, the rescue mission was sorely lacking on several fronts. For one, many of the Bangladeshi officials who had shown up to help rescue victims were hardly equipped for the mission, as most had no protective clothing on and even wore sandals. Worse still, according to the outcry of relatives of trapped victims, the government even tried to end rescue missions prematurely. Volunteer rescue workers had to step in to assist the government officials in their so far unimpressive rescue efforts by letting down rolls of fabric into the wreckage to help survivors escape. All the while, unknown to victims and family, the United Nations had reached out to the government of Bangladesh to offer their assistance through the International Search and Rescue Advisory Group. Sadly, faced with the opportunity to save lives and prevent needless deaths, the Bangladeshi government chose to save face and protect national pride instead. Meanwhile, hours were turning into days and days into weeks, and yet many were still trapped in the ruins of Rana Plaza. In the blistering heat, victims trapped in the rubble who had luckily escaped being crushed to death were now facing the possibility of certain death by dehydration. And so to save themselves, some of them were now resorting to drinking their own urine while they awaited salvation. To make matters worse, a fire broke out at the site of the disaster at some point, and the authorities were forced to temporarily suspend their search for survivors. Each passing day only served to further reduce the victims' already slim chances of survival, thanks to the government's method of handling the disaster. In all, the Rana Plaza rescue mission spanned over 2 weeks, but ended with a miracle. On May 10th, the last day of the rescue efforts, a certain woman named Reshma was found under the rubble, neither dead nor seriously hurt. Unfortunately, for thousands of others, this same miracle wouldn't be granted to them, as the Rana Plaza collapse would record a death toll of 1,134, with approximately 2,500 others severely injured. Now, as tragic as the collapse of the Rana Plaza was, and the high death toll that followed, perhaps nothing was more tragic than the fact that the entire disaster was primarily fueled by greed. The owner of the building, Sohail Rana, cut corners at every turn in the building and maintenance of Rana Plaza. Unfortunately, when the chickens finally came home to roost, innocent people were the ones made to pay for Rana's sins with their lives. It all started with the building of the plaza in the first place. You don't need to be a civil engineer to know that a solid foundation is the first step to building a structure that will last. Still, Sohail Rana chose to build his 9-story building on a filled-in pond. On top of that, all building materials used in the construction of Rana Plaza were substandard from start to finish. So not only was the foundation of the building pitifully weak, but the structure itself was also weak. Now, one would assume that knowing how weak his building and the foundation on which it sat were, Sohail would have been more careful. But as it usually is when greed leads the way, caution is replaced by the unbridled desire for gain. So perhaps not so surprisingly, Sohail, with the permission of the obviously corrupt authorities, would not only accommodate factories in his building, but he'd also go as far as to add an additional 4 floors, which were not included in the original building permit, just so he could max out on all possible profit-making opportunities, risky or not. Multiple times, Sohail was warned by his architects that the building was not in good shape to take on factories, but Sohail completely ignored their warnings, choosing instead to feed his lust for money. Rana had another chance to redeem himself when the first signs of cracks were observed in the building, but rather than do the humane thing and let the necessary inspections and repairs be carried out, Sohail declared the building safe, encouraging workers to go about business as usual even in the face of obviously life-threatening cracks in the walls of his building. Apparently, when the generators were turned on, the vibrations proved too much for the disintegrating building. And so, already in a fragile state, the vibrations became the final straw for Rana Plaza, crescendoing into the horrific collapse that followed. But as despicable as Rana's actions were, and they truly were, culpability does not end with him. The developed world cannot exactly be excused from sharing in the blame for what happened to those over 3,000 people in Bangladesh. Going back briefly to the day of the collapse, April 24, 2013, one of the reasons there were so many people in Rana Plaza on the day it collapsed was because managers of the factories in the buildings forced their workers to resume work on that ill-fated day. Managers at Ethertex, one of the factories at Rana Plaza, even threatened to withhold a month's pay from workers who refused to resume work. Now, while their actions are not inexcusable, the factors surrounding their directives are actually worth considering. For instance, the managers had been informed by Sohail Rana that the building was safe, and secondly, the factories were under pressure from their big brand clients to complete their orders on time, which is where the developed world comes in. The demand for fast fashion among consumers in the developed world is horrifyingly high, especially when you consider the price that has to be paid for these demands to be met. Because consumers in the West are so hungry for cheap clothing made fast, Western brands, hoping to take advantage of the need gap, are resorting to outsourcing their production to disadvantaged labor markets just to meet the demand. But even while doing that, Had these brands just been a little more concerned about the welfare of the people who created their inventory, the disaster at Rana Plaza could still have been avoided. Sadly, up to that point, many of the top brands that were supplied by the Bangladeshi garment industry cared very little for the working conditions of their foreign employees. All that mattered was for orders to be completed and delivered on time without question or excuses. Workers were working for minimum wage and weren't even unionized, so they had no voice to speak for themselves about their safety and how returning to work under such conditions threatened that. With no voice and limited choices in life, these victims showed up for work on that ill-fated day, perhaps knowing somewhere in their hearts that that day could very well be their last. Now, it's been 10 years since the disaster at Rana Plaza, and one might wonder what actions have been taken to prevent a recurrence. Well, on the positive side, you could say that there have been improvements in fire and building safety in the Bangladesh garment industry, but a lot more still needs to be done. For instance, some clothing brands have signed an accord to improve factory safety in Bangladesh, but North American multinational brands like Levi's, Gap, Walmart, and Amazon refuse to sign. And even in spite of the agreement, we still have cases of these brands engaging in unfair business practices like delaying payments, drastically reducing orders, or even canceling orders altogether without prior notice. When workers try to unionize and fight for themselves, they face harassment, not to mention the fact that they are still grossly underpaid to date. Speaking of paying workers, shortly after the incident happened, a meeting among the 29 brands that sourced inventory from Rana Plaza was proposed. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss compensation for their disaster victims. However, only 9 of these brands showed up, including Primark, Loblaw, Bon Marché, and El Corte Inglés. Brands like Walmart, Auchan, Carrefour, and Kik refused to show up. Even when compensation was to begin, the process was extremely difficult for affected families. For instance, Primark had demanded that relatives of deceased victims provide DNA evidence in order to receive a $200 compensation. For people living on minimum wage, many of whom had lost their own breadwinner to the collapse, this was outrageously expensive. Thankfully, the U.S. government stepped in and provided DNA kits to the families of victims. Still, today there are dozens of families that haven't been compensated, being unable to back up their claims with documentation. Perhaps these ones could have taken some level of consolation, however little, in the fact that human agents involved in the catastrophe at Rana Plaza would be brought to justice. However, even that could not be granted to the victims and their families. In 2016, close to 40 people were arrested for their involvement in the many failures that led to the collapse of Rana Plaza. These included factory owners, government officials, and of course the owner of Rana Plaza, Sohail Rana. However, currently, only Sohail is in custody, waiting his murder trial. As for the rest, some have been granted bail, others have had their charges dropped, some are on the run, and others are now dead. Fast forward to today, and one could say that the garment factory disasters at the scale of Rana Plaza collapse have drastically reduced in Bangladesh. It does not mean that the Bangladeshi garment industry has been accident-free, but it does speak to the great things that can happen when international efforts are made. The only tragic aspect of this positive development is that it took the deaths of over 1,000 innocent souls to make it happen. As one journalist put it, the voices of workers often speak loudest from the grave. Watch these videos next if you found this video interesting. Thanks for watching. Please hit like and subscribe for more.